Hey, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. We have just a few more minutes until the webinar starts. I see we have 5 attendees in the room, but hopefully we'll fill up a little bit more in the next few minutes. So please just stand by. All right, I want to give just 1 or 2 more minutes for people to come in. I just got an email that some people we're joining on a Teams chat, so give me just 1 minute to redirect people. Can see the numbers increasing now. Alrighty then. So I think it's good if we go ahead and get things started. Welcome everybody to the second session for today's webinar. It is the second session. I know it says session 1 there, but it's actually the second session of our 2024 webinar series on the Article 6 implementation toolbox. And today we're going to be discussing Guide 2 of the toolbox, which is titled Developing an Article 6 Host Party Strategy. Before we begin diving into that topic, I would like to welcome some of our guests to give opening remarks, starting with Mrs. Mullen Alberg, who is the Deputy Head of the Division for International Financing of the Transformation and International Market Mechanisms at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Mullen, thanks so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marshall. So warm welcome also from my side. I'm very happy that we start this webinar series on Article 6 Toolbox today. The carbon markets under Article 6 is an important tool for countries to engage and to achieve ambitious climate action. Carbon finance offers host party countries a way to mobilize finance for their most difficult to implement mitigation action now and set themselves up to a longer-term greener growth and sustainable development. However, participating in carbon markets under Article 6 can be complex. Impacts regarding development goals and regarding the NDC needs to be taken into account and evaluated when country wants to engage in cooperative approaches. Thus, the development of a comprehensive Article 6 strategy is the best way to maximize benefits and minimize risk for host countries when engaging in cooperative approaches. So for this reason, the SPARK project focuses on increasing the preparedness of countries, not only in our partner countries, Colombia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Zambia, but also on a global level. The team of partners of the SPARK project take extensive effort to learn from countries and contribute to global understanding of best practice for practicable implementation. There are two ways the SPARK project does outreach to other countries. The first is the community of practice for Article 6 implementation countries SPARK has created, which provide a forum for carbon markets practitioners from private and public sector to exchange knowledge, as well as nurture young talent through a research mentorship program. So in 2024, we are excited to have our first cohort of 8 graduated students undertaking original research on carbon markets linked to their areas of academic study, and we're looking forward to their findings. And the second part of our outreach is this Article 6 implementation toolbox, which we are all here to learn more about today. The toolbox was launched officially in Dubai, where we presented the first 3 guides, and all of which are available on the SPARK website for you to download now. We are hopeful that these global public goods and the many tools, reports, case studies, and other materials that make up the toolbox will be useful for you in your Article 6 implementation journey. So thank you to the team for your hard work in bringing our extensive experience to put these guides together. And I'm pleased to see such a huge interest from our large audience online. So we are looking forward to sharing more with you, but also learning from all of you in the months and years ahead. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our exchange today. Thank you.
Thank you, Malin. Thanks for those words. Next, I'd like to welcome the Director General for the Global Green Growth Institute, Dr. Frank Reisberman. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you, Malin, for very nice opening remarks, which I think already very nicely introduced the project. We are very happy with this project. It's one of the handful of projects that GGI is undertaking that prepare developing countries for, indeed, an Article 6 new carbon market. GGI supports our member countries as an intergovernmental organization. We support our member countries in their green transition, and particularly achieving their climate action by developing policies, but then increasing access to green and climate finance. And for many of our member and partner countries, the potential of getting carbon finance through Article 6 is of very high interest. Almost all developing and emerging economies would like to sell ITMOs. In many cases, they don't really understand what it takes or what the real potential is. So there is a lot of capacity building. We've worked with about a dozen countries now that are seller countries. And I think the toolbox will be relevant to these, but also to many other countries. At GGI, we work with particularly Sweden, Norway, and then Germany through this ICI project, and also New Zealand and Australia. But we know there are other countries that aren't as active in the capacity building sphere, like Korea and Singapore, all keen to buy. So there is, I think, an active opportunity on the buyer side, many of which are also our member countries, and a very large number of countries interested in selling as well. That's partly why GGI is so keen on these capacity building projects and on this toolbox that is presented here today. It's a key part of efforts to get countries ready for the new carbon market. And at GGI, we are operationalizing our carbon transaction facility, which will have both a trust fund for capacity building and a number of trust funds that will intermediate between buyers and sellers ready to transfer ITMOs. So thanks for Germany, for the ICI program, for funding this quite strategic project, and our many partners that I think from this morning's experience, Marshall will introduce at more length, so I don't have to here. But it's good to see that we had, I think, a maximum of about 115 participants in the session this morning. And last I checked, there's already 77 participants in this session as well. So I think that really shows there is a large appetite, a large demand for this kind of information. I'm happy to see these webinars. Hope there will be many more interesting sessions. Marshall, back over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Frank, for those remarks as well on behalf of GGI. And again, Mullen, thank you for the introductory remarks. I'm going to go ahead and start a very short introductory presentation from my side before we move into the rest of the webinar. I'll give a few minutes introduction about Spark as a project, and then our colleagues from Carbon Limits, Benjamin Harris, will give a snapshot of the overall content of guide number 2, developing a host party strategy. And then also a deep dive on the selection of authorization criteria for your Article 6 strategy. And then this will be followed by the experiences from, apologies for that slide, from Colombia, which will be delivered by Adriana Gutiérrez from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. And then we hope that you will use the Q&A function to put questions into the panelists and the speakers. You can do that at any time throughout the event. So just find the little Q&A in your Zoom application, and you can add those and share them with us. So very briefly, I wanted to give everyone a little introduction about the Spark project. Spark is spelled with a 6 in the middle, so it seems kind of confusing, but it's pronounced spark, like what you see with a fire there. It is a 5-year, 20 million euro program that is funded by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action of Germany through the International Climate Initiative. And GDGI is the leading partner. But we're not the only partner. We have a consortium of organizations with extensive experience in carbon markets and climate change mitigation, such as the UNEP the UN Environment Program's Copenhagen Climate Center, Communal Credit Public Consulting, GFA Consulting, and Carbon Limits. Altogether, we implement our activities both at the global scale, but also in the country level. So in Colombia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Zambia. Ultimately, what the goal of the project is climate change mitigation, aiming for mitigation projects that can provide both high environmental integrity and create sustainable development co-benefits, really harnessing additional finance for mitigation projects in our partner countries. We have 4 work packages that are linked to the countries that we're working with, providing a wide range of technical assistance and capacity building support for emissions planning, data collection and assessment, governance framework development, which is sort of what you will hear about in today's webinar, and then also mitigation activity development, where we actually aim to find projects that can be implemented and then trade ITMOs under the Article 6 carbon market. We also have 2 cross-cutting work packages, which Malin was describing in her opening remarks, linked to the community of practice for Article 6 implementing countries, and then the toolbox, which you'll hear more about today. Overall, we aim, to implement the program through a learning by doing approach with broad stakeholder engagement, and really helping our government partners understand how to operationalize the theory and the rules that are created in the Paris Agreement and in the Paris Rule Book for Article 6. So without going in any further depth there, I think I will go ahead and pass it over to my colleague Benjamin. Benjamin is working with carbon limits as a senior consultant and has been one of the major forces behind getting the toolbox out the door. So he is the perfect person to explain to you what on earth is in Guide 2. So, Benjamin, over to you.
I promise it's not that complicated, Marshall. So thank you so much for those introductory words. Good afternoon from Oslo. This is Benjamin Neras from Carbon Limits. At Carbon Limits, we've been leading this work package on toolbox development. I'm going to get into more details as we go in the presentation, but it's an honor to get the chance to talk to you about all the work that we've been doing and sort of the results of it. So let me go straight into the actual content of the presentation. First of all, I would like to briefly present to you what is it that we've been working during the last months, probably more than a year now, in regards to the Spark toolbox. So first of all, you see that we have, or we are developing 6 different guides that sort of attack or address different audiences. The first one that is promoting ambition and transformation and change using Article 6 is the one that talks to pretty much all stakeholders. However, the rest of the guides are either meant for host country governments or for activity proponents. It doesn't mean that you cannot read it if, for example, you are not an activity proponent and we are talking about a host country government guide. However, sort of the language and the type of guidance that we provide is meant for the audiences that you see on the screen. So we have guides 2, 3, and 4 that cover topics such as Article 6 party strategy, Article 6 party strategy, the one guide 3 on institutional frameworks, and the integration of domestic carbon pricing instruments with Article 6. And then we have the last 2 guides that talk to activity proponents, and in this case, discuss topics such as screening and developing Article 6 strategy and financing and contracting Article 6 activities. The guides that are already available and ready for you to take a look online are guides 2, 3, and 5, and guides 1, 4, and 6 are soon to be ready, so expect them to be available pretty soon, just before summer, fingers crossed. So a lot of work is happening in parallel to make this happen for all of you. So when we talk about a toolbox, we're not talking about only developing 6 guidelines. In reality, we're talking about going beyond those guidelines and creating additional materials and tools that will support target countries and in general the international community towards the end of this project, which is 2027. Some of the examples that I would like to highlight are in the 3 different categories or bubbles, so to speak, that you can see on the screen. So for example, we talk about creating training materials that will make capacity building easier in target countries and in general an international community, but also developing, for example, additional resources such as templates and forms, fact sheets, sector-specific materials, and we can also talk about developing potential tools such as MAC analysis, investment analysis, and other quantification tools that can accompany all of these materials that we're going to be developing as part of Toolbox. The main priority here is that all of this information or documents, materials, and so on is useful and is applicable. So that will be perhaps the main criteria that we are using to select what type of new documents or materials we are developing throughout these years. To provide an introduction to the topic on Article 6 strategy, I would like to take a step back and look at what is out there in the international community. First of all, by sort of presenting to you an analysis that we have done, where you see different countries that have already presented to a certain extent an Article 6 documents. These documents are either referred to as Article 6 strategies, Article 6 guidance, or Article 6 institutional frameworks. But in reality here, you will see that each one of them cover different types of topics in their own ways. So we have compared the content of Article 6 documents published by 7 different countries to understand not only what elements are covered, but also to see if there's some sort of best practice that is already emerging. This table that you see on the screen is highlighting commonalities and the differences that are in the country's understanding of a national framework document for participating in Article 6. And you can see there is an inconsistency in the incorporation of certain elements of Article 6 documents. But also, it also means that this is because of the evolving approach that countries are taking towards Article 6, and hopefully, and this is a possibility that we are assuming, is that countries will then be developing an updated version or refined version of these documents to cover more of the missing pieces that you can see on the screen. So the consistencies also that you can see as well on those green dots or green cells suggest that there is an emergence of some sort of best practice. So it's already interesting to see what countries are selecting to include in these documents regarding Article 6. And we're going to be keeping a close look into this as we continue the implementation of these projects. So stay tuned. So in summary, each country is taking their own approach towards Article 6. And what we're trying to do through the SPARK project is to provide the baselines and the fundamentals, or what is that a host party should be developing as part of their Article 6 strategy, but also provide to them additional optional information or criteria that they should take into account when deciding and defining their own Article 6 strategy. So anything that can become additional to help them adapt better to their national priorities. Therefore, when we talk about Article 6 governance, we, in the context of SPARK and the toolbox, we are talking about 2 different guides. Guides 2, which I'll be talking about later or as we continue in this presentation, but also about Guide 3 that hopefully within 1 or 2 months, you're going to be receiving the invitation to have a similar webinar to talk about institutional frameworks. In reality, we have followed a very similar approach to both guides, following the same general processes such as analyze, consult, decide, and implement, putting most of our efforts on understanding better the analyze section or process with all of the different activities and decisions that need to be taken into account, but also the implementation part, which can be, for some jurisdictions, the most challenging part when it comes to making this strategies or documents operational. So digging deeper into Guide 2, and what you see on screen is basically the setup. What are the different chapters that are covered within Guide 2? But also I have highlighted in yellow those chapters which I'm going to be going into more detail today and sort of give you a sneak peek of what type of content we're presenting in the guides. So hopefully after this session, you're gonna be more interested on reading the guides if you haven't yet. And also I have highlighted an activity or a decision point that is in chapter 4, that is in red, which is basically the point where we're gonna be focusing the most today, and that will provide the baseline for the discussion later with our country representative from Colombia. So without further ado, let's go into the sneak peek first of chapter 2 that talks about identifying opportunities. Here, the main idea is to present what, when, and how to use an Article 6, and this is based on a multi-criteria analysis. This is primarily done based on what funding is available out there for mitigation, and also depending on the national and regional priorities. So some of the opportunities that we can start assessing and prioritizing are the ones that you see on the screen. For example, high-hanging fruit. So basically any expensive abatement cost activity that we are interested in promoting at the country level. Potential to achieve conditional NDC goals. The prioritization for certain climate technologies. So in other words, if we're talking about piloting new experimental or expensive technologies. Alignment with national policies and strategies. Contribution towards sustainable development goals, the scaling up and replication potential of mitigation activities, and the support and fostering of international cooperation. So how to better identify and assess opportunities, this is chapter 2 in the guide. Going into another chapter where we're gonna do a little bit of a sneak peek is chapter 3 that talks about assessing overselling risks and choosing a strategy to address it. In this case, we have presented an analytical framework that will allow us to assess the overselling risks of different types of activities in the context of the specific host parties and DCs. So the proposed approach that we are suggesting is based on 6 different steps that will guide host parties on deciding what type of strategies or decisions they can put in place in order for them to mitigate overselling risks. The first step that you see on screen, that is called Screening for NDC Greenhouse Gas Inventory Visibility, tries to answer the question, is the proposed activity or activity type visible in the greenhouse gas inventory used in the NDC reporting, or is it outside of the scope of the host party's NDC? Once we have answered that question, we can go to step 2, which is the categorization of NDC, that also tries to answer another question, and here is, how likely it is that the activity type overlaps with actions that the host party needs to reach its unconditional NDC goals. Once we have a good categorization of our NDC, then it's going to be the next step of assessing what type of risks we are facing based on those activities that we are looking into as part of our NDC or outside of our NDC. So if we identify some of these activities as high risk of overselling, we suggest going into step 4 and create a negative list. This negative list will basically make some of these activities ineligible for becoming an Article 6 activity. On the contrary, if we identify some of these activities as low risk of overselling, then we propose the creation of positive list that could support the implementation of these activities with perhaps fast track or streamlined processes and without any additional burdens into the authorization of them. And lastly, we are talking about those activities that are not low risk or high risk, but those that are somewhere in the middle, what we call medium risk of overselling. And in this case, we suggest the selection of a strategy on how to better mitigate them, which is something that we're going to be exploring a bit in more detail in the second section of this presentation. Moving on chapter 5, we talk about how to decide to meet the prerequisites. And here I would like to point out again one of the main features of these guides, which is not only to present what are the bases and the fundamentals that host bodies needs to comply with based on the requirements already outlined by Article 6.2 and 6.4 requirements, but also to provide to host bodies other options and ideas on what can be done in addition to the basis. So this could support the host bodies on identifying and tailoring better to their own needs and going a little bit beyond the basis of the requirements of Article 6.2 and 6.4. So in these cases, we're talking about, for example, providing the suggestion to choose units and accounting approaches, or in other words, the metrics, choosing the timing of authorizations. Are we talking about ex ante or ex post? To define which uses of IDMOs to authorize. Is this for NDC compliance? Is this for international mitigation markets such as CORSIA, or for other purposes such as the voluntary carbon market? And finally, to define an approach to adaptation and the overall mitigation of global emissions, which are mandatory in the context of Article 6.4. And finally, but perhaps the most important section that I would like to highlight is Chapter 8, that discusses how to make your Article 6 strategy operational. And in this case, the main point is, when we talk about Article 6 strategy, we're not talking about only one policy document. We're talking about a set of documents that should be put in place in order for host bodies to make your Article 6 operational. So here we're talking about creating, amending, or adopting new regulation, guidelines, and tools that can support the main policy of Article 6 strategy to have more teeth, so to speak, on how we can make this a bit more robust. So just to give you some ideas, when we talk about creating or amending secondary regulations, normally we're talking about developing guidelines on creating accredited verifiers or an MRV framework and requirements. We talk also about creating guidelines and tools on for example, developing new methodologies, or the registry of activity participants and activities, the use of existing methodologies coming from CDM or the voluntary carbon markets, and perhaps, again, going into the most important, I will say, to create capacity. Here, we're not talking only about creating internal capacity, which is a topic that we extensively dig in detail in Guide 3, but also to create external capacity. So basically, we're talking about involving the private sector, in particular activity participants, from the early beginning into the planning and development of these documents, so they are aware and that the buy-in from the private sector is already in place by the time that the Article 6 institutional framework and strategy is in place in our host parties' countries. So with that, I know that I've been going through all of this content fairly quickly. Hopefully it was clear enough. If not, happy to answer any of your questions, but perhaps I will take a small pause here and ask you, with the help of Marshall, if you would like to share with us if you have heard anything new from this very small sneak peek presentation that I have right now, and if so, what is it? I know that there's a poll, right, Marshall?
Yeah, we put a poll up that asks the question, did you hear anything new? What was it? So just new terms, new concepts, anything that Benjamin said, is it new to you? Yeah, the question, the options are the links between Article 6, strategy and institutional arrangements, how to better prioritize and assess opportunities, the difference between a positive and negative list, the various tactical decisions to make, and then of course, nothing, I'm a pro. And it looks like out of 40 respondents, we have 2 pros in the room. Benjamin?
Now there are 3, so we should be touching base with these experts because we would like their feedback, but also the feedback from the rest of the audience, because I think it's super interesting to see if they have had the opportunity to implement some of these new ideas, right?
For sure. And also, yeah, we need a few more answers, actually, what I'm noticing compared to the previous session. We had more people responding, so I'm hoping we can get those numbers up on the poll. Okay, all right. Somebody was listening. That's good.
No
No, okay.
pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. But anyway, five pros and a relatively even split among the four options there. So good to hear that the information is useful. I want to remind everybody that you can still put questions in the Q&A box. So if you find the little Q&A bubble at the bottom, you can type them. We're here to answer your questions as Benjamin goes ahead and moves on to the next section of the presentation. And yeah, you can see the results of the poll as well.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, perfect. So let's do that. As I was mentioning before, we're going to be going into a bit more detail in one topic in particular, and in this case is how to choose your authorization criteria and conditions. I hope that you can see my screen without a problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you, Marshall. So in this case, I would like to dig into first the authorization criteria, and in this topic in particular, we have four different categories that we have identified. The first two, they come directly from the Article 6.2 and 6.4 guidance. So these are criteria that are already set in these documents. So it's nothing new or something that you might not be familiar with. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing them, but rather focus on the other two that look at criteria that should be aligned with the country's priorities and existing policies and regulations and general context. So these type of criteria, for example, we're talking about supporting long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, such as LT-LEDs, as you can see on the screen, or other climate strategies. Also the alignment with perhaps any relevant national or sectoral policies and strategies, the compliance with any anti-corruption laws and conventions, which are extremely relevant, and the compliance with other local regulatory requirements relevant to the mitigation activity type. And in this case, we're talking about environmental impact assessment or technical standards that might be in place already in our jurisdictions. In addition, we suggest the implementation of criteria to address high and low risk of overselling, and this is something that we already introduced during the last or the first part of the presentation, which are the negative list and the positive list. As mentioned before, negative list allow us to manage and make some of those activities ineligible because of their high level of exposure to overselling risks. On the other hand, the positive list support the selection of certain activities and make them easier to be implemented at the country level or host party level. So just to give you an overview of what is it that we've been doing as well. So we are not only doing a very high level overview of what Article 6 governance documents are being out there internationally, but we're also looking into the small details. So we've been assessing these six different countries' apologies to try to identify if they have used positive and or negative lists to define their eligibility of project activity types for authorization. So as you can see on the screen, Ghana, Zambia, and Cambodia are one of the early movers in establishing authorization processes and criteria. For example, Ghana and Cambodia have established positive lists containing mitigation activities and technologies that provides an automatic additionality. In particular, Ghana has prepared a negative list that they refer to as red list. These contain 9 unconditional mitigation programs of action in Ghana's NDCs, from which mitigation activities are not eligible for authorization. Lastly, another example, Zambia uses the concept of a negative list to indicate the different types of mitigation activities that are excluded from Article 6 transactions. So very interesting what is happening in the international arena in regards to the positive and negative list and how some countries are already using them in order to mitigate and manage better their overselling risks for the different mitigation activities. Lastly, I would like to also introduce to you the idea of authorization conditions, and these come for actually managing those mitigation activities or Article 6 activities that have a medium risk of overselling. You see them in a very odd form, almost like a cross, but in reality, we would like to show this as sort of a prioritization list. So the one that you see on the top has a higher priority, whether the one at the bottom has a lower priority based on the level of complexity for implementation, but also the level of risk that it can impose to private sector investment and appetite. So the first one is the baseline derived from NDC goals that limit transfers by using the NDC goals as a baseline for credited activities. In this case, why do we prioritize this first? Is because it directly addresses potential overselling risk from a given mitigation activity. However, it requires a high level of detail on the specific actions and targets that are outlined within countries and DC. Then we have sort of in the medium rank cap on transfers, which is a limit of the total volume of transfers within a given period, or periodically adjust the cap to reflect progress toward NDC goals. So that gives a lot of flexibility on host parties and sort of allow them to adjust as they go. The same goes with sharing mitigation outcomes that authorizes only a portion of the emission reductions or removals as mitigation outcomes to be transferred. It could even take the form of a buffer that might eventually be released to the acquiring party once NDC compliance is clearer. And this is an approach that, for example, Ghana has been proposed in its Article 6 rules. And lastly, on the medium section, we have the limited crediting periods, which basically suggest to shorten crediting periods to reduce the total inmost transfer for a program. Why is that? Because on the other hand, longer periods during which mitigation outcomes are generated and internationally transferred, this could create a higher risk for the host party to meet its future NDCs. And lastly, we talk about charging a fee to support mitigation in the country. So this is also called ILMO compensation, corresponding adjustment compensation, or corresponding adjustment fee. And this idea is to capture at least part of the opportunity cost of transferring the ILMOs and applying corresponding adjustments. The main issue with this last point or this last condition is that this might scare the private sector, in particular activity participants, if fees are perceived as too high or if there's a lack of transparency on how these fees will be managed by the host party government. So with that, I will conclude my presentation by thanking you for your attention, but also thanking all the amazing authors and supporters throughout the development of Guide 2, Randall Spalding-Fetcher, Irina Isakova, James Hayslip, Mark Hopkins, and other contributors within the consortia, in addition to our amazing reviewers, Manfred Stockmeyer and Alison Starling, as well as our supporters from the German government and the UNFCCC. So with that, thank you so much. And I will leave with the next slide that I think is super relevant, right, Marshall?
Yes, totally agree with you. So what you're seeing here is the QR code to the spark.org website where you can download the guides. So feel free to go to www.spark.org to find those and also learn more about the project. If you have specific feedback, like what kind of feedback, Benjamin?
So, for example, if they find out that perhaps one of the conditions that we just presented is actually more useful than others, or maybe, I don't know, even a typo, if you ask me, I will love to be able to correct those, right?
Yeah. Yeah, any feedback that you have or thoughts, please feel free to email us or even questions if you need clarification about how something is described. I want to say we have about 4 open questions in the chat, and we have 2 that have a particular like. So Benjamin, I wanted to ask you to go back 2 slides to the where it discusses what the selecting authorization criteria with the 4 different columns. Somebody asked, could you give some examples of negative and positive list activities or criterias that we could develop? Some examples of activities or criterias.
So, for example, in positive list, we have identified that, and sort of connecting as well to the prioritization in chapter 2, we have identified that some countries have selected implementation or the allocation of certain technologies. So, for example, and here I cannot cite directly if there has been this technology in particular, but we can say carbon removal technologies. So that can be one of the best examples for positive list, considering that this is a technology that is fairly expensive and a technology that perhaps is not, and quite likely is not included as part of the unconditional NDC. So that would be, one of the perfect examples to take into account for positive lists.
Okay, great. Yes. So I think there will be a lot of examples you gave. You showed also a slide after this for all the different countries that have their strategies in place. So wherever you can access those strategies, maybe you also can review the criteria that other countries have selected.
Right, and that is an ongoing work within the whole project, the consortia project, and we'll be at some point releasing some of that documentation and examples. So hopefully it will become a public domain and you have the opportunity to take a look and do some comparison, because I think it's super valuable to see what other countries are doing and the different approaches that are out there.
Yep. Okay. Great. Thank you, Benjamin, so much for your presentations and for the information. There are some additional questions for you waiting online, so please feel free to answer those. But I would like to now welcome our special guest for the evening here in Korea. It's Adriana, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. For people who might not know, Adriana Gutiérrez is the lead negotiator for market and non-market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement for Colombia. She works with the Directorate for Climate Change and Risk Management, leading the carbon markets teams at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. She's also the lead negotiator for the ILAC group. So some of you, we have quite a large representation from the region, the Latin America region today. So some of you may recognize her from other webinars. But Adriana, we asked you here today to talk about the kind of deep dive that Benjamin just went into when we're talking about authorization criteria. We know that it can be a bit of a challenge for countries to decide how do we choose the criteria, and then once you do it, where do you put them and how do you share them? So we wanted to know from the experience of Colombia, what is the process that you're taking to establish your authorization criteria, and what tips might you share with your peer countries?
Well, for everybody, I think the experience could be quite different. It depends on the national framework as well as the institutional framework that each of the country has. But the first thing that we did was taking all the decisions that were there. When we began this, we didn't have the carbon limits guidelines. So we had to start from scratch. And what we did first was to start reading the decisions. So we made kind of like a work with everybody in the mitigation team and read everything and tried to get some input. And after that, we tried to also to understand certain parts of the text that we didn't get completely clear and that could have a little bit of interpretation depending on your country. And that's how we devised first some guidelines, internal guidelines that were quite technical, and they were centered on how will be the process of authorization, and what kind of steps we had to take in order for this authorization to be real. And during this process, we kind of saw that we were missing some things, even though we kind of had like the whole picture more or less clear, because we already have an MRB system kind of device for our national registry. So we kind of based everything on our own registry. And after that, we saw that we were missing something, and what we were missing was how to define additionality. We kind of had already revised everything that Benjamin showed us during his presentation, such as the accountability, the accounting part, in which we had to see up to which point we could maybe do some kind of transfer, and how could we limit this transfer in order to prevent any kind of having unreal units, because that's something that can happen if you don't have your accounting clear. So we were already working during that time as a country on the carbon budget. So we kind of used that idea of the carbon budget into our analysis. And likewise, we were seeing how the inventory was progressing. We were already also kind of making projections on our accomplishments of the NDC. We had during that time a goal of reducing 36 megatons as a national development plan. So with that, we were already analyzing the trends on what was happening in our inventory and in certain sectors in the country. But then after that, we again realized that we were missing something again. We were feeling like there was something that we were missing, and that's where we went into additionality. Additionality couldn't be only from the accounting part. We also had to see different things. We started the exercise doing a negative list. And when we started with the negative list, we realized that we also could do a positive list. And that's what we are working on right now. We started with the negative list for a reason. And the reason was that we didn't want to limit the imagination for the project developers out there. But we also realized that having just a negative list is not enough, and we needed to analyze further in order to give everybody a fair right of participation into the system. And that's where we are right now. We are right now trying to work on this positive list. We want to work on a portfolio, lines of investment, and that will be only on additionality part for Article 6. However, we have other things under additionality that we have been working so far, such as accounting, but we also have the project cycle, and we have already revised how the authorization will be done and how we could process certain things. And we already have some suggestions on who should be the one authorizing, who will be like the most neutral one in doing this kind of exercise. We have almost everything ready, but since we have a lot of, let's say we have kind of like a lot of experience, we have more or less 7 years of experience in carbon market, because we have a national voluntary carbon market. And we have seen that there are certain things that have to be ready before Article 6 comes into place as a country. And that would be to have everything in place in order in the sense of, for example, validation and verification, or the whole system of conformity, which includes this validation and verification. But we as well saw that there are things such as baselines and environmental integrity criteria, as well as other things that are really technical, such as standards and methodologies and all that kind of stuff that also carbon limits mentioned before. We saw that has to be in place before we launch any kind of regulation for Article 6. And that's why we are working right now first on a regulation on what carbon markets are, because that's another thing that we have realized. Not everybody understands the world of carbon markets. It's quite difficult. The knowledge is quite limited. We get lots of questions from the citizens, such as asking, how do I participate? Can I participate? If I have my house with a few trees, can I participate? So there are a lot of doubts and questions, and there are a lot of actors, and each actor has like a little piece of the story. So we realized that we had to clarify that as well before, and that's a piece of legislation that we are also working on before launching any kind of Article 6. But we have a and we thank the project as well, because we have been able to progress because of this project as well, that have helped us with many things, such as this piece of legislation as well, and as well as the legislation for Article 6 that we also have been working on during the last months. So yeah, it has been quite of chaotic, but as well, we have been trying to take everything step by step in an orderly way, having really clear what step 1 to the last step is, and if we need to go back and revise everything, we go back and revise everything, because sometimes things can change, and since negotiations evolve, we have to evolve together with the negotiation. And I guess with that, I will finish my intervention.
Thanks, Adriana. Actually, I want to follow up with a couple small questions, just some things that I'm noticing in the Q&A. For example, what has been your process? And one of the questions here is there a case study on how to involve private sector successfully in this process? Now, I'm not asking for you to provide a case study, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how countries can do this. Hello, can you hear me? You're unmute. You're muted right now.
Yeah, I think it's due to the internet connection. We don't have a case study, as you said, but what we can give you as a advice to all the countries in the region, as well as other countries worldwide, it's not easy to involve the private sector. We have to see up to what point as a public sector we can involve them. Obviously, we have been having some spaces with them, hearing them, knowing what they have been feeling in the market, what things or pieces of legislation are missing, or what guidelines they need from us. So we have tried to hear them, and that's why we open some spaces for them. However, I will advise each country to revise up to what point they feel liable and as well comfortable with talking with the private sector. It is important to talk to the private sector. I can say that for sure, but the limit on up to what point you talk with them, it depends on how the country feels about it. But we can also talk country to country in case there are some kind of not feeling comfortable with this, but I guess country to country could be easier in some spaces as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important concept for everybody to know anyway, right? There's no exactly right or wrong way to do this, because it's up to your country. In some ways, you have to choose authorization criteria that help you meet the requirements of the agreement, but there's a lot of strategic and tactical decisions to make. So that's sort of what you were describing this whole time. So Adriana, the other question I wanted to ask you was about the availability of Colombia's authorization criteria. Is that made publicly available or not? And if not, is there a reason for that?
It's not public yet. I guess we have shared some of this work with the country partners with which we have talked about this, such as Singapore. We have not made it public yet, but I can say to everybody that they can use, for example, the carbon limits guidelines that includes already many of our criteria and process that we have had in place in Colombia. And we will try to make it public as soon as possible, since we will need some kind of permission to public certain things, and that will depend also on the order of the publication of the legislation, but we will try to be more open to show certain things of our process as well.
Very interesting. I mean, that is great that you're here anyway to share your insights from the inside. Maybe, we have just 2 minutes left here, and I still welcome anybody who has questions to type in the Q&A. I know probably a few of us here would be happy to stick around and answer if you have any additional questions. But Adriana, for a last word, I'd like you to just give one tip. What would be your first tip for a country who really thinks that they want to get involved in the carbon market, but they don't really have anywhere to start, or they're not sure where to start? What would be the first thing you would tell them to do?
That's a difficult question. But I will say that the first thing to do is revise your NDC and see how you will be able to go further on your own NDC, because your NDC is kind of like your baseline. And if you already have your baseline, you will have more clear where up from which starting point you have. And yeah, I guess the NDC has almost everything in accounting, as well as even a negative list can be set up by using the NDC.
Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think this is a good time to wrap the session. Adriana, thank you again for your time, for joining us today. Hoping to see you soon. Everybody, for the participants, we would like to gather your feedback on the session today. So in the chat box, you can see a link to a Microsoft Forms survey. So please do us a favor and have a click on that survey. It should only take you 1 minute to fill out, and it will help us a lot, as we will be doing, probably at least 10 more of these webinars this year. So your thoughts and recommendations on how we can improve are very much appreciated. So I guess with that, I should thank everybody for your time, and yes, welcome you to send us feedback, and hope to see you in the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.